spare. And now Harry takes us back to his school days. He explains that he regarded most of his teachers as kind souls because they largely left him alone, realising that he was dealing with the loss of his mother and all of the associated turmoil that comes with that. He tells us about his drum teacher, whereby the gentleman was confined to a wheelchair, which meant that lessons were shortened because it took time to get him out of a van and then put him back in the van. And he explained that some of the teachers, however, despite some being understanding, some were less so. And he makes reference to his history teacher, Mr. Hughes Games. And he explains that he was eccentric and that basically his history teacher couldn't understand how he, namely Harry, couldn't understand British history. And apparently, Hughes Games states at one point, "I cannot fathom it, Wales. We're talking about your blood relatives. Does that mean nothing to you?" "Less than nothing, sir." Now, Harry says it wasn't just the case that he didn't know anything about his family's history, he didn't want to know anything. Now, one wonders if this is accurate. Is it simply the case that because he's not very bright, that learning about such things is difficult for him and also he therefore doesn't have any interest? Or is it that, alongside a combination of the fact that he just isn't interested in his family? Which is a strange attitude to have at this age. Could it be that he's saying, well, as a consequence of what has happened with my mother, actually, I'm no longer interested in my family? You would think that, given that he comes from a very famous family whose bloodline is very easy to follow, many people are interested, of course, in their family tree and decide they're going to research it and then find out, actually, this is quite difficult to do. And at the end of the day, I found out nothing more interesting than a great-grandfather was a dung collector and a great-grandmother once had a fling with a policeman or such like, that it becomes too difficult and too tedious wading through parish records, etc., to go too far back. But most people have an inherent interest in the history of their family, and you would have expected that for Harry, he would have had a huge interest in what's going on. Now, again, is this the case that we are getting a revisionist history here? And one has to say that this is a considerable risk with this publication. First of all, memories are difficult. They're treacherous. If I was to say to you, tell me what you were doing this day 5 years ago, you would probably struggle to do so, unless something remarkable happened to be occurring or had occurred at that time. But many people would say, I struggle to remember what I did last week, never mind 5 years ago. Of course, certain key events stick in your mind, but if you were to be asked about the humdrum and things that were going on, you would have difficulty in remembering. Now, of course, if you've written your thoughts and feelings down in a diary, in some kind of journal, it's far easier then, of course, to have a reliable source of what you were thinking or feeling about events at that time. As far as we're aware, Harry kept no diary, and therefore what he's having to do is drag things up from his memory, which means, first of all, he may not remember everything, and secondly, the things that he does remember are quite probably inaccurate, and bearing in mind the trauma that he has experienced, that has a further impact upon his recollection of certain events. But moreover, this publication has been written as a consequence of his desire to tell his story rather than having it said through other people's lips. And we now know that Harry wrote this over the last 2 years. Where has he been these last 2 years? In the grip of a narcissist. He has been given the Kool-Aid. He has been brainwashed. And therefore, it is very clear that much of what he'll have conveyed to the ghostwriter, much of what he'll have either written down himself or recorded into a recording device to pass on to the ghostwriter will be tainted by today Harry. Today Harry will be affecting Harry of the past. So the example I just gave there in the previous video about his attitude around Britain and colonial power is tainted by today Harry. And we have to keep that at the forefront of our minds in this analysis of him, that the grip of the narcissist has tainted the way that he behaves. That's very clear. Not only is it very clear because we know that's what happens as a consequence of involvement with a narcissist. Those of you who have been involved with a narcissist will recognize that that's what's happened to you. Furthermore, all you need to do is look at how Harry used to be to compare him to how he is now and see that he's a completely changed person in demeanour, outlook, attitude and behaviour. So we can see the sort of before and after, and we know that in the last 2 years he's been in the grip of a sustained devaluation and that his attitudes and thoughts and conduct have all been tainted not only by the sustained devaluation and the pressure that it places upon him, but generally that he's been indoctrinated with his wife's outlook in the world. We've seen the way that his language has changed. You can spot the, for want of a better description, wokeisms that he utilises. And therefore, it's important to keep at the forefront of our minds as we go through this analysis that a lot of what he will recall is going to be tainted by today Harry. The Harry that is in the grip of a narcissist, the Harry that has been indoctrinated with different ideas. And it shows here. I find it highly suspect that he felt that it was less than nothing about his family. I think that it was today's Harry that's tainted the view of yesterday's Harry about not wanting to know anything. He explains that he liked bits and pieces of history, but the micro details he wasn't interested in. Now, that is probably more likely to do with his lack of academic progress. And he explained about an instance where they were talking about a pretender to the throne who was called Charles Edward Stuart, and the teacher's talking about this individual and then basically turns and says, "Wales, you must know this." "Why must I?" "Because it's your family." And then everybody laughs at him, and he realises, of course, everybody knows that he's royal, but why did the teacher have to remind everybody about that and use that loaded word, family? Interestingly, again comes up this whinging where he writes, "My family had declared me a nullity, the spare. I didn't complain about it, but I didn't need to dwell on it either." Well, in actual fact, he does dwell on it. This is the name of his book, and he raises it back then, once again showing a degree of hypocrisy. He then approaches the teacher after the lesson and asks him to stop, explaining that it's embarrassing and that it's not fair that he was being singled out. And he basically harumphed about it and said, "Well, look, the more I call you out about not knowing things, the more you'll end up learning." And he then gave Harry a wooden ruler which had the name of all of the monarchs on both sides, as in rulers on a ruler, and basically said that he could keep it. So it was some kind of peace offering that was being granted to Harry. But it does demonstrate that he clearly, in that instance, wasn't one with an aptitude for learning. He then goes on to tell us about some of the misbehaviour that he gets up to, explaining that with his best mate, who was also called Henry but went by the nickname Henners, and how they would roam the corridors after lights out and occasionally getting bashed across the back of the head with a copy of the New English Bible for being caught out of bed after lights out. They'd also sneak outside and would go to a pick-your-own farm and grab the fruit. And then he would talk about a Mr. Marston who carried a bell, dinging it to try and get people's attention. and he would try and get the attention of the boys, who often wouldn't listen. And he seems to find it rather entertaining that this gentleman is trying to get the attention of all of the boys, dinging his bell, but nobody's listening to him. He also explains, of course, that Ludgrove was just down the road from the psychiatric hospital Broadmoor, and that Broadmoor would occasionally test the siren. And he then recalls an anecdote about talking to his father about the fact that Broadmoor's down the road. Broadmoor's a psychiatric hospital which will often include criminals. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, stayed there, for example. And if I remember correctly, I think Ian Brady, one of the Moors murderers, was there also. Anywho, he then talks about how he mentions Broadmoor to his father, and his father explains that he visited a similar place, and he assured Harry that most people there are quite gentle, although he recalls one person standing out who claimed to be the Prince of Wales. And so his father tells the amusing anecdote about the Prince of Wales meeting somebody else who believes that he's Prince of Wales. And then he relates, "Who knows if I'm really the Prince of Wales? Who knows if I'm even your real father? Maybe your real father is in Broadmoor, darling boy." And he says it as a joke, but Harry doesn't find it funny at all, given the rumour circulating that his actual father was one of Mummy's former lovers, as he puts it, Major James Hewitt. And he talks about, and it's clearly a sensitive issue for him, understandably so, about the similarity in the hair colour. And apparently the tabloids couldn't get enough of this joke. And that shows, he talks about that, which evidently demonstrates how that would be something that would hurt him. And he recalls that nearly every biography of him, any longish profile, touches upon Major Hewitt and still has the suggestion that he may well be his father, even though the fact is that his mother didn't meet Hewitt until long after he was actually born. And it demonstrates the sensitivity that Harry has with regard to this sort of long-running joke about his paternity, which in a sense is understandable, that he wouldn't like his paternity being questioned. Coming ahead, a shift in his schooling. But before we get to that, he's going to talk about the other woman. Join me there.